Before the next episode of X-Job Downloaded starts, I have a big favour to ask. If you've enjoyed any of our episodes so far, please can you click on the follow button on your platform. I'm on Apple, Spotify, Google, Amazon and YouTube. It costs nothing to follow, but makes a real difference to me as a podcast producer. Thank you. This interview is being tape recorded. My name is Paul Maleary and this is X-Job Downloaded. And today I'm going to interview His Honour Judge Nigel Lithman. Now, Nigel is a barrister, he's an author and has sat as a judge, I think it's in St Albans and Luton in that part.
That's right, and as a recorder at the Old Bailey.
A recorder at the Old Bailey. Now there's a place, formidable place.
Yeah, formidable, and it lives up to its hype. But you always bring the same approach to things wherever you are.
Yeah, absolutely. But where did it all begin for Nigel Lithman? You know, you're an East London lad, I suppose, and where did it all begin?
Well, I don't know why you suppose that, but as it happens, you are right.
Yeah.
So I'm an East London stroke Essex boy, born and bred. We were probably what was called a middle-class family, proper middle class. My dad was a consultant anaesthetist. My granddad was a GP, and we were brung up in Wanstead. And then I went to school in Essex, in Bancroft in Woodford Green, quite posh. If that's not a contradiction in terms, you can be quite posh in Essex. and that's really where and I'm a very loyal person. That's where my loyalties lay, and that lasted really through my career. I was always very loyal as an Essex person as well.
Yeah, and that's where we met originally. Interesting enough, Simon Coxall, who I interviewed on an earlier podcast, he was a Bancroft boy.
Oh, was he?
And he found a load of history around people that were killed in the First World War, because there's a lot of people died. And there's a lovely monument that's there in the middle of the quadrangle. And is always particularly visible on open day, when the founders of the school come down from Bancroft's Avenue or Bancroft's Road in the East End. Oh, right.
And it was a charitable institution, as so many of these public schools were. And in order to greet them, they would come down wearing mink coats or mink line coats, carrying maces. And me and a couple of mates once went out, and there was a cafe on a roundabout. I can't remember actually where the roundabout was, but it said Ted's Cafe. We decided to get the Ted's Cafe flag and fly it from the mast to greet them as they arrived in their Daimlers.
How brilliant is that? So what's your family background? I mean, your father was an anaesthetist.
Don't want every consent. Yeah.
But what's your family background?
So my parents were born in England. My grandparents, which is not unusual for a Jewish family, weren't, but somewhat unusually, one grandfather came from South Africa and three from Eastern Europe. And of course, they were chased out of Eastern Europe during the pogroms that took place at the beginning of the century, of the 19th century, that is, or the 20th century. And they came over to England. So that's their background.
And settled in London? Or?
And settled in London. My grandfather settled, actually. Life came full circle for me when I ended up going to sit at Luton. My grandfather settled in Luton, where he had the esteemed pleasure of having one Benny Hill comedian as his milkman. Hence Benny's song.
Really?
Ernie the Milkman, because Benny Hill actually was a milkman. So he was a GP, and my mother and father, they met during the war. My father was served with the RAF, and he was mentioned in dispatches in North Africa, and he met my mother while they were both in uniform at a London hotel, and she was in the transport division of the Red Cross, and that's how they then settled in the Wanstead area in London, where my father took up his medical practice.
Was Wanstead a predominantly Jewish area at that time, or?
Wanstead was probably quite typical of my life in as much as it wasn't a predominantly Jewish area. You had to move further out to Woodford, etc. for that. But there were some Jews. And now the house that we sit in, which is, perhaps I better not say where it is, but anyway, it's quite close to Highgate, is also has Jews, but it is not predominantly Jewish, which is the way I like it. I've always worn my religion on my sleeve, because it was a very important part of my background. So I'll deal with that now. My great uncle wrote the words to what is now Israel's national anthem.
Fascinating.
And his name was Naphtali Imber. He came from Eastern Europe. He was a total alcoholic. When he died, tens of thousands of people followed his body to be buried in New York. And later, when the State of Israel was founded, it was disinterred, and he was taken to Jerusalem for reburial. So rather than strictly Orthodox, very observant Jews, we were traditional Jews, keeping traditional values, but also I had a very strong ethos in Zionism. I know that's an unfashionable thing to say, but it's the truth. Now, where did that come from? It came from the fact that I was born in 1952, so the Second World War had ended 7 years previously.
Yeah.
And we were just getting used to the sight of millions of bodies being uncovered in emaciated form in the concentration camps of Poland. And I was 6 years of age when I first started watching them. And so to me, the need after the European history of Jews, which I went on to study at the Hebrew University, that the need for a homeland, I've always thought was unarguable. I know there are some people that would say that they don't make the best of their homeland, whether they do or not. Most countries don't make the best of their lives anyway, although that's partly political and partly governmental. But the actual need for a homeland is absolutely important. Let me. Sorry if I'm wittering on, but I suppose let me deal at the same moment with this, in case this becomes too Jew-centric, which it's not meant to be. I've never found a conflict in being Jewish and being English. My priority has always been being English. I've never hesitated to describe myself as English or British. And I am, as it happens, an English Jew. But the loves of my life and the way I have lived my life are particularly English values. I mean, for my troubles, as you know, I support Leyton Orient, currently top of League Division 2. Come on, you O's. But so I've combined that with enjoying other sport, particularly as an onlooker, or often as an onlooker, and just the British way of life, which is a wonderful, wonderful way of life. But I don't minimize, because I don't think it's something to run away from, my Jewish ancestry.
Your heritage. No, and I think it's really important. I mean, we commemorate, and rightfully so, the losses during the Second World War. And I think it's right, you know, the Holocaust Day, and I've done some great work with Rob Rinder and some other people. And I'm fascinated. I'm fascinated in people, but I'm fascinated in history. And I think it's right that we remember those 6 million people that died in the camps. Your family, when they moved over from Eastern Europe and they came as a persecuted group.
Yeah.
I wonder what that was like for them, because that was quite, you know, to move into the UK. In what year would that have been?
Well, my father was born in 1913, so it was his father who came from Eastern Europe. But it's important to try not to gloss over the different aspects of one's family roots in an attempt almost to glamorize or sanitize them. And there is that issue, because whilst it's right, for instance, that my grandfather on my mother's side rode a horse to school when he was in South Africa, he would live off the land by catapulting sparrows and burning them over hot coals. But he then went to Witwatersrand University to study agriculture, and then moved over here to study medicine. So although that's a rather glamorous way to describe someone's life, my grandfather on my father's side, he came over here not speaking a word of English.
Wow.
So the question as to how families survive is, for 3,000 years, they have managed to survive and remain a race and a religious people. But it's obviously been very, very difficult. But they've learnt to make the best of life, to try not to moan about it and get on with it. And of course, a large number have been extremely successful. That's not to say that there aren't soup kitchens in different parts of London.
Well, yeah.
And the label that somehow they are all successful is misplaced.
Well, I remember going to Petticoat Lane as a kid, and there was a Jewish mission there for people that needed help. They needed support.
Yeah.
And I think it's Middlesex Street on the right-hand side as you go down. And I think as a kid, you always thought, well, every Jewish person you'd ever heard of was successful.
Absolutely. But the contradiction in terms, I speak a lot about him because I'm very fond of him, and he had a big influence on my life. But my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, you can sum up his character in this way, is that he was involved in local politics. He was a very strong Labour socialist guy, and he had his GP surgeries were in the poorest parts of London, which were in West Ham and Newham and around the docks. But somehow, rather than the plight that doctors find themselves in these days, particularly the junior ones, of trying to earn a living, in those days, GPs were paid according to the size of their practice. And he had a particularly big practice, partly because I don't suppose he knew an enormous amount about medicine, but he was a very nice bloke. And so people would go to him and say, "Doctor, I'd like you to help me. I'd like to buy a premium bond. Or I've had this notice come through the door. Can you please help me? Because I can't read it. What does it say?" And so he was part of that what's called old school, I suppose. But because of that, he managed to accumulate sufficient wealth that he drove an old upright Rolls Royce. But he also liked birds that were the feathered variety that were native to his home and to Europe. And so he built an aviary, and he had about 50 birds. So on a Sunday morning, I would walk round to his house, and he would have been in the aviary cleaning it out. So he's got a brown raincoat done up with a piece of string with bird's mess all down it. And he would climb into his upright Rolls Royce, and we would drive to Brick Lane to Club Row Market. And there he would get bird seed. And people would greet him on the streets. "Hi, Doc, how are you?" Excuse me. "Don't worry, we'll look after the car." So he was this little old fella getting out of his car in his, if I may say so, shit-riddled coat and an old Homburg hat, walking off down Brick Lane. So it was a wonderful mixture. It was a wonderful group of contradictions that was his life, and probably is the life of Jews in this country. I'm just going to say this probably, then we can probably get off the topic, otherwise it will be too centric, which is that because of that Zionism, I'm very happy to have bought a home. We have a second home in the north of Israel, and we go there and spend a lot of time there. I will be protesting when we get there about what is going on with the government. I won't protest about the same thing in London, because otherwise one gets mixed up and confused between the rights of the Jews to have a homeland and the behaviour of their government. But I will protest against what's happening out there at the moment.
That's fascinating. It's a fascinating subject, and as I say, we could talk for hours. We could talk for hours anyway, but we could talk for hours.
You can. Whether I'm here or not is almost irrelevant.
No, it's very relevant. So you're at Bancroft School, and you go through your education there. What was that like? We're talking, what year did you join there?
So I was at Bancroft between 1963 and 1970.
And what was that like then as a school?
It was great, actually. I don't know. I mean, just life's such an odd thing. As I look back and I say it was great. I was a cheeky chappie.
You surprised me.
I know would surprise you. I was naughty, but not too naughty. I was lazy. So I would arrive at school and I'd go to the locker room to find someone who I would know has done his homework and crib his homework from him. But there was bullying there, which was obviously awful. There was a fair amount of snobbery there. There weren't girls there. So that changed when I left, or it had just started to change. No, it changed after I left. And so there were girls in the sixth form then, and now it's co-ed. But I think a lot of aspirational families tried to send their children there, to whom education was important. But it was a private school, or largely private. And as such, in those days, I'm afraid it did not attract the best teaching staff.
Really?
Because a lot of the teaching staff were those that might not be able to get into a public sector school.
Wow.
So as a result of that, I think it was as a result of that, not my own fault, I didn't really get any sort of proper science education. And so the option of going into medicine was not there. But not just that, I really had a very positive yearning towards the arts subject, towards English and history and geography, etc. And so I was very happy to pursue those and ended up going into a non-scientific background, namely the law. But I was lazy, I was cheeky. And there's something now, I do a lot of public speaking, as you know, Paul, and there's one aspect that I confess to myself to, which is that I wasn't just bad at exams, I was frightened of them. And so although I probably didn't do myself justice, I ended up with passes in everything, but not great passes. And so when ultimately I applied to read English at Cambridge, it wasn't of any great surprise that I didn't get in. But I think that those failings, if you like, if that's what they could be called, have done me well. And a part of my speaking career, because when I go and speak to universities and to students and say, this was my background, and although that background wouldn't be sufficient for you to go into the areas that I went into in those days, it does show you that through tenacity, you can try and get where you want in life. And hopefully, like me, you all just happen to fall into something that really suits you.
That's fascinating, because to suggest that you've fallen into something and then go on to be a QC, now KC, that's hardly falling into something. You've carved a way for yourself that there aren't many people that have done what you've done. So
well, I'm not unique.
No,
there are plenty of people, but there are plenty of people that will have been put off either because something's too difficult or because they've tried and they haven't succeeded at first, and rather than try again, they might have tried again and nothing more. But let's not confuse the issues. These days, if you try and don't succeed at something, you may not have the opportunity to try again. I'm thinking about those that might be trying to go into the professions, single mothers, and simply don't have the chance. They just don't have the resources to do that. And so I suppose I did have, and that goes back to a middle class background, which I'm not smug about, but I did have a safety net, I suppose.
Yeah.
Even if not an actual one, certainly a psychological safety net.
But so you didn't go to Cambridge, but where did you go then?
So what then happened was a series of things. So this was in the late 60s that I was looking around as to what I was going to do. Paris was burning. Student riots were rife.
Yeah.
The flower power and the age of free love was there. Although I probably didn't utilize it as much as I should have. I really thought either I would do something, either I would teach, or I would do nothing. I would somehow just sort of, I don't know, just live a sort of fairly free and easy life. And somehow I would survive. I remember I had part-time jobs. I worked in Woolworths for £8 a week, I think. My first fine for parking on a zebra crossing with my first car, which cost £12, by the way, in Austin A35. My first fine was £8, appearing in good old Chelmsford Magistrates Court, because I'd stopped on a pedestrian crossing to buy my then girlfriend and myself a hamburger. And when I got out of the car and had to speak to the policeman, by the time I got back in, she'd eaten them both. and that's what really stuck in my craw. Not the hamburger, but the fact that she'd eaten them both.
How funny. How funny. What was your father's or your parents, what was their direction around your life, though? How did they try and influence you?
Well, I have to say, they were wonderful in the sense that, and credit where it's due, they wanted me absolutely to do what I wanted. They didn't want me to do nothing. They didn't want me to laze around. And we were discussing before we began this recording, we were discussing how it was traditional very often for parents to say, look, qualify in something, and then you can always choose a different direction. Well, the response to that could be, well, why should I qualify in something if I know what that direction is?
Yes.
It's got a different application these days in the law, which is, although I had a very broad brush beginning to my career at the bar, and I would do both common law and criminal law, I knew that my bent was always towards doing crime. And so I didn't really need, but it did no harm, the broader approach. But credit to my parents, they said, if you want to go, which I did want to do, to university to read English, go and do English. In fact, I didn't, as I've said, go to university to do English. And as a result of that, I think I read as much literature as I could during my 20s and thoroughly loved English literature.
Do you think that gave you I mean, you've got a huge eye for detail, and I accept that you say that you were lazy, but do you think that that's love of literature and overall understanding and assisted you with, because you have to read thousands and thousands of pages as a barrister?
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it, Paul? But I mean, my wife always tells me now what she's reading, and she reads voraciously. I mean, a load of rubbish, but she reads it voraciously. I just can't really read. I mean, it's very odd because I've now finished, I think, my second book, writing it. But as to what I will read, I have hobbies that don't involve reading.
Yeah.
And maybe that's because, like you, we had to read. Well, you had to deal with it firsthand. Yeah. I was lucky. I was only dealing with it secondhand. You had to confront it. I had to just read about it. But I was reading a novel a night. Might be a short novel, or in the case of frauds, etc., tens of thousands of pages of a novel. And of course, their novels were far stranger than fact.
Yeah.
And make your hair, if either of us had very much, stand on end.
Yeah, it is because I was always amazed when I attended Crown Court that the barrister would have literally read the papers the night before, because the previous day they'd have been working on a different case, and I was absolutely rapt with it. Where did you actually go to university to do your law degree?
So it was all very complicated, but having said how I worked in Woolworths as a holiday job, I then decided to have what was untypical in those days, a gap year. And I went off to the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and I did a course in the history of European Jews. And I did it with Americans largely, and they were doing it as part of a credit towards their degree. Of course, It wouldn't count as my degree anyway. So my lecturer at the time said, well, the qualification is no use to you at all, is it? And I said, no. He said, well, do you want to sit the exam? And he saw a glimmer of hope enter my eyes. I said, no, not particularly. And so I didn't sit the exams. I then came home. My father had a life-changing accident, and he was in a serious car accident that left him substantially disabled when he was in his 60s then. And that really turned our life topsy-turvy. And I was visiting him along with the rest of the family. We were going up to Stoke Mandeville to visit him. I was working part-time. Then I moved from Woolworths to make thermos flasks in Loughton in Essex. And so, as I said, we would go regularly to see him. And then I thought, well, I've got to do something. What shall I do? As one would, I applied to do Oriental Studies, and I was accepted at 2 universities to do that. I was then spoken to by a number of people who said, this really is a complete waste of your life. Can you do something sensible? And in those days, you actually could read for the bar directly.
Really?
You could. And so one of the places, which was my first contact with it, one of the few places that gave this facility was at Chelmsford, at a technical college. So I went up there to speak to them about it, and as happens in life, met somebody called Alan Jones, who was to have a great influence on me, and who was obviously, I had visions of Oscar Wilde when I met him, and I think he did as well. And so he said, well, why not come here? And rather than read for the bar directly, you can do a London external degree. So I thought, all right, I'll do that. I've got to do something. So this is all with 3 weeks in advance of the course. There was no planning really of any sophistication. So I found myself at Chelmsford. And then, heaven knows who's going to be listening to this after, but I'll confess to something, because you, Paul, know that I ended up doing a great deal of work at Chelmsford Crown Court.
You did.
And the reason that happened was because I was dating somebody, and I didn't realize that she was going out with a solicitor at the same time. And she persuaded him to instruct me. So he was the one who encouraged me not to go out with his girlfriend, but he encouraged me to go to Chelmsford Crown Court. Now, in case one forgets about it, can I talk at this moment? I know we're going out of sequence, but let me just mention as to why I thought it a good idea, and it probably says a lot about me, really, as to why I chose to practice so much at Chelmsford. Because when you practiced in London, any case that comes in to you can go to one of 12 or 13 courts. And in each of those courts, there might be, as at the Old Bailey, up to 20 courts inside the court. And so there were dozens and dozens of potential areas, and you couldn't cover all of them. No. Whereas all of the crime in Essex went either substantially to Chelmsford, or in those days to Southend. Basildon hadn't been dreamed of. It was just a horrid view in somebody's mind about what went on in Basildon. But anyway, and so I thought any crime that's committed in Essex is bound to go to Chelmsford. And Essex is a particularly roguish county.
Please.
And of course we both have wonderful, wonderful stories of all the crimes that we've been involved with one way or another in the county of Essex. So that is why although I could tend to just brush aside any idea of deliberateness, anything other than any haphazard opportunity, of course I realize from a, inverted commas, business point of view, that the prospects of building a big practice were higher in Chelmsford than in London. As I did more and more and did better and better, it spread to London. And then when I was in Silk, I was substantially practicing.
And what chambers were you at?
I first of all went to a common law set, which meant that I was doing the whole gamut of advocacy, matrimonial cases, contract cases, and criminal cases. But it was crime that always interested me. And so ultimately, then I was in one Harcourt buildings. And then as I specialised more and more, I was approached by somebody saying, why don't you try and come to 3 Hare Court as it was then? And that's what I did. And then I moved from there, or we all moved as a set, to occupy premises at 2 Bedford Row.
And who held the top? Who was the at that time? Do you remember?
In my first chambers, there was a lovely chap called Tony Cripps. I was offered pupillage with his son, Seddon Cripps, who was 6'4" or 5 and an old Etonian. And I was 5 foot nothing schnip and ex-Chelmsford College. So we didn't have things that were obviously in common yet. And if I hadn't been his pupil, I probably never have had the courage to talk to him. But as always, these things are based on personal interaction.
Yeah.
And I remember he suggested where we might go for our first day's lunch. And we found ourselves out in Oxfordshire. I said, well, why don't we call into Henley and go to a pub there and sit by the river? And so that's what we did. I think he liked the gall that I had for suggesting it. I bought him to celebrate my pupillage a necktie, but I could only afford one that ended up being tied around and dropping 4 inches from his collar. So for a very big man, he looked very silly. But I love, as happens, we always are in awe of our pupil masters, or we should be. And so that was him. So that was at 3 Hare, forgive me, at 1 Harcourt Buildings and at 3 Hare Court. My first set of chambers was Michael Lewis, then there were a couple of others, and then finally Bill Clegg, and now Brian Altman and Jim Stone.
I find it absolutely fascinating going to the Temple, and because all the history that's wrapped around there, people listening to this won't realise that the Temple was the place where Dickens based his characters for the Pickwick Papers. Yeah. You've got the church down there where the Crusades actually set off from.
Yeah.
It's an amazing place. And as soon as you go through that wicket gate, you're going into a different part of the world.
And you know it. That's the great thing. So if those are people that haven't visited the Temple, and although there are 4 Inns of Court, so there was the Inner Temple, Middle Temple, Lincoln's and Gray's, but those that are actually in the Temple as such are Middle Temple and Inner Temple. I didn't have any contacts to persuade me as to where to go, but I did have a cousin who was at I know that sounds like a silly contradiction, but I did have a cousin who was a barrister, although he never gave me any good advice apart from this. He said, join Inner Temple, because it's got a big car park. And so if you want to park your car, then you'll get a permit far quicker than in one of the other inns. And so I did that, and it's just Dickens, you say it all, Paul, it's where Dickens focused on his characters like Jaggers in Great Expectations. But it was just a larger than life environment. The place was run by an under-treasurer, it's called. He was well known for being a total boozer and once knocked over the gates to the gardens, and I think ended up in some trouble for that. You were mentioning you had an experience with a 3-legged dog.
Yeah.
And in fact, the under-treasurer had a white poodle with only three legs as well. So this poodle walking around on 3 legs and the under-treasurer rocking around between 2 legs, having had a little too much to drink, was quite a sight to behold. And we used to have to dine there. as is well known, part of the qualification for the bar was dinners, and we would have to dine there. And there was somebody who would come up to the students in order to share their drink, which was very kind of him, and also to scrounge cigarettes. And his name was Florence O'Donoghue, and a real Irish character. And you can, in the end, you can make your life appear quite remarkable when you draw a circle around all of the coincidences in it. So the coincidences are these. First of all, so far as Florrie O'Donoghue was concerned, he was ex-Trinity College, Dublin. And he was at Trinity College, Dublin, with my in-laws. Later I was to meet and marry Debbie Abrahamson, and three of her family, like her, were at Trinity College, Dublin, and they were there with Florence O'Donoghue. But I mentioned in passing that my father had a life-changing accident and that he was an anaesthetist. And out of the woodwork to help him during this terrible time of his came a number of his closest friends. And one of them turned out to be Sean O'Donoghue, who was Florence O'Donoghue's brother.
Well, I never.
So life is just full, isn't it, of remarkable coincidences?
It is. I don't think I told you this, but when I first joined the police in the area in Braintree, there was a judge called Judge J.C. Llewellyn. And during the Second World War, he was the chief constable of the Special Constabulary. And he had this small cottage, and we lived there free of charge. We were in the police, and he allowed us to live there free of charge. In fact, we got evicted in the end because we hadn't painted it outside, and I think there was an inordinate amount of pornography that my colleague had left playing around. I will blame it on him. But yeah, it was another, and he had chambers in the temple. And I find your world fascinating.
Yeah. Because
the history that is wrapped around the judiciary, the wearing of the wigs, people don't get it. They don't understand why we've got so much tradition in our courts, but our legislation and our court practices are carved into history. You only have to look at the Vagrancy Act, which was built around the coming back of the soldiers from the Napoleonic War, which we still use. You know, it's bonkers, but we still use that. The Offences Against the Persons Act, all those types of things. It's carved into history, and therefore we still use it because it works so well. What was that like when you first qualified as a barrister and you've got your wig and you've got your gown and everything's there? What was that like, the first case where you went in to represent somebody?
Well, just stepping into that from the world you're just describing, it was an amazing environment. Sitting there at those dinners, hopefully finding a couple of people who would not drink so you could have their share, because you sat in messes of four. And I once got so tiddly that as I was leaving the temple, I had to stop the car because one could cross the middle of the road in the car, turn right towards Westminster, and you went through a gap. Well, by the time I was leaving the temple, I could no longer see the gap. So I had to get out of the car and check that the gap was still there. And I remember doing that. But it was, and one of the people who I dined with, I said to her, "Why did you choose the inner temple?" And she said, "I chose it because of my conviction." I said, "What do you mean? Your conviction that the place was better than all the others?" She had no, said, "I was done for shoplifting about 2 years ago, but the inner temple didn't seem to mind." Anyway, let me say, I recount all of these things, etc., in nothing like the truth available on Amazon. Right.
Indeed. We'll get to
that's the plug. That's the plug. But let's go back to the question, which was the first appearances in court. First of all, what we're speaking about, which is you've been talking about the magic of the environment of the temples. I particularly, as you know, am the last person in the world to think that overshadows the issues that confront the junior bar and barristers today, and the state of the criminal justice system, along with the state of the National Health Service. But to get back to your question, my magistrates' court practice, because you start doing small cases, obviously, at the beginning and going to the magistrates' court, began in Grays, and I was working a lot in Grays in Essex. And those that are unfamiliar with it, Grays was particularly one of the poorer areas, down by docks as well. And there was, I think, a refinery close by, and Grays in Thurrock in Essex. And as one would leave the train in the morning, you would simply go past a series of what was the equivalent of pound shops.
Yeah.
I mean, now, in those days, there were probably 60p shops, but pound shops and pawnbrokers. So these were people who were living there, who were living hand to mouth. And so when you went into the magistrates' court, you thought you really are doing what you set out to do, which is to represent the underdog, those that were in need of someone to speak on their behalf, to fight for justice on their behalf. And very often I'd be in conflict with the police officers at the time, because the police weren't bound in those days by the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. So the notes that they were reading from, the ink was still wet. And all of the other ways that I can insult you, Paul. And
you won't insult me.
And your ilk. So that was life in the magistrates' court. And of course, so you learn to cross-examine, and it shouldn't be, but it was, and it is great fun until you see the consequences of it. And I learned the consequences of it fairly soon when I was defending somebody in an allegation of assault on the police. And it was a very, very minor assault. It really was. And of course, I cross-examined the policeman uphill and down Dale, and I was pretty offensive to him, I suppose, and within the rules and within what was expected of me doing my job properly, and thinking what a great performance that was and how well I had done. And at the end of it, my client, probably because of the way that I'd conducted the defense in part, I certainly hadn't soft-pedaled because that wasn't my way. He ended up going to prison. Maybe if I'd have soft-pedaled, he wouldn't have done. But I thought this really is quite serious. Obviously, the consequences of what I did in the sort of cases I was doing later were far greater. But it did bring me up with a jolt that this isn't just about having fun and a good time. And as my wife would say, it wasn't all about me. It was about something bigger than that.
But the life, I mean, as a police officer and as a barrister, we literally had people's lives in our hands.
Yeah.
I remember Stephen Harvey was prosecuting my first ever Crown Court case, and it was a former police officer who had committed a fraud over a car accident. And that chap got 11 months. Judge Taylor locked him up, gave him 11 months. And now he'd be getting a community service. But it was really catastrophic to that individual because he lost his family, he lost his livelihood, his mortgage went, the whole lot. And I think that the catalysts that fall in place, actually, they're so life-changing, and we are part and parcel of those changes.
And the example that you give also, of course, it shows how dependent on the vagaries of who you draw in the lottery of life and the lottery of the court hearing. Yeah. So the judge you mentioned was a particularly ferocious sentencer.
Yep.
He was a religious man, and he brought the wrath of God into his sentencing. So whereas one might be more compassionate in some cases, and I tried to bring, when I sat as a judge, compassion and kindness with me onto the bench. For somebody like that, then to have suffered or to have been sent to prison for 11 months when he might not have been would be earth-shattering. But we've all got to do our jobs. That's the important thing. Somebody said to me when I was speaking at a gig the other night, somebody said, how important is it to be kind as a judge? I said, well, isn't it important to be kind and nice always? Because if you're, provided you're doing your job, if you treat a defendant when you're a judge with kindness and respect, and show him that, he will find that disarming, not what he's expecting, and he will cooperate with the process, and he will know whether you're a copper, whether you're a judge, whatever, you're doing your job.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm smiling because there was an article that came out recently that has told judges not to be so hard on people in the court process. Now, I'm a bit old school because I still believe in, yes, sir, no, sir, 3 bags full, sir. I am a servant of the court. I'm there to provide the best evidence, or I was the best evidence that I could put before the court. A judge was never there to be my friend.
No, but let me give you perhaps an example of what I mean. I remember we were talking about a firm of solicitors in Whittam, and I remember going into Chelmsford Court for them, and it was in relation to a pretty unsavoury case. It was a sexual assault of some nature, and the judge, in sentencing him, I thought sort of almost took leave of his senses, because he turned to him and said, "You are a dirty old man." And I sentenced you, etc., to 2 years or whatever it might be. And because I was never one to leave anything alone and sit quiet, I stood up after the process and said, "Can I remind you that you're here to sentence my client? You're not here to insult him. He doesn't need that.
No.
He's got a guilty verdict from a jury. They've done their job. You're going to send him to prison. You've done your job. You're not here to insult them."
No. I bet that went down well.
Of course it did.
Have you ever been disappointed by an outcome? I mean, has there ever been you thought, "Oh, do you know what, that's not right," or... I mean, that's a strange question, but
no, it's a good question, and it's very topical, isn't it? To when you don't know the answer to something, say that always to compliment the question and the questioner. Of course, there must have been hundreds of occasions when I was disappointed in convictions, but I suppose, dare I say it, the slightly better question, slightly more pertinent question, not a disappointment, but am I disappointed that justice didn't prevail?
Yeah.
And I'm sorry to say that I recognize the overwhelming likelihood that the majority of people I represented actually were guilty. And so the system of justice still works because they weren't all guilty.
No.
And you've got to find the ones that aren't and ensure that they are acquitted.
Yeah. So
of course there have been instances, but none spring out at me.
But I think people don't realise, and you know my family's history and how we work and the things that my father's firms my father's work. People don't realise that if somebody comes into a situation and they lie to you as a barrister, it's then you're professionally embarrassed. You can't deal with that as a...
No, actually, Paul, you're wrong.
Oh, right.
If they lie to me as a barrister, provided, and you might think this is a distinction without a difference, provided they don't admit that they are lying.
Right, yes.
Or ask you not to propose a lie.
Yes.
Or invent their defence.
That's what I meant.
Then you can represent them. What you can't do is knowingly participate in a lie. And it's no good in saying, yes, but in your heart of hearts. Well, in my heart of hearts, that may be. But you're not judge and jury on your client. You've got a judge and jury to be, and a prosecutor to deal with that. But provided he maintains that he is not guilty, you, of course, would say, well, I will advise you. And if the advice is appropriate, the evidence in this case is really stacked up. It indicates in every sensible way that I'm afraid you are guilty, but more importantly, you're most likely to be found guilty, and you will get credit if you plead guilty.
Yeah.
But I'm not asking you to plead guilty to something you didn't do. And I always used this fallback position, which is that your plea is part of your property. How you plead is entirely a matter for you. You can say to me, I am not guilty, but I propose to plead guilty. And then I would not be able to mitigate on his behalf. I would not be able to mitigate on his behalf and say he didn't do it, because the judge would say, well, then he's not guilty.
Yeah.
All I would say is effectively he is pleading guilty because that is what he wishes to do. So it all gets a bit entangled. I suppose, and probably those listening to this who aren't in the job or ex-job will think it's slightly artificial, but that's the way it is.
Well, yeah, absolutely. What was it like when you were made silk?
Yeah.
What year did you take silk?
1997. There was a symmetry to my career, which is that I did 20 years odd as a junior barrister, and then I did 20 years odd as Queen's Counsel.
Yeah.
Then.
And how does that work? How do you get called?
Well, there are two sorts of work three sorts of work, I suppose. When you're prosecuting, the Crown Prosecution Service can use in more serious cases Queen's Counsel in murders, serious fraud, etc. When you're defending, the same criteria applies, which is that legal aid will be granted if the judge thinks it's appropriate to represent people, invariably in murders and in serious fraud as well. And so you tend to do a smaller amount of work, you do a smaller number of cases a year, and as somebody once said, you tend not to have a practice, you do cases.
Yeah.
So I went around the country, furthest between Carlisle and Plymouth, spending maybe 4 or 5 months of the year away, and the rest of it was in London, often at the Old Bailey, and I was doing work there. But and people would say that I'm not known for my modesty, but if I can be immodest, and I don't mean this in a boastful way, I think I became a better and better advocate all through my career. And there wasn't a moment when it didn't improve. And I think that's quite important.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing about taking silk is that it to some extent it's artificial and a lot of nonsense, in as much as there are far better candidates than I was who don't get silk. And equally, there are worse candidates who do get silk.
Yeah.
Like anything in life. It's a lottery. But it is a progression. It is that you can aim at. I mean, I suppose if you want, look, I know policemen, ex-job, who were DCs, PCs, and that's what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
And they had it worked out to as a fine art.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's what they wanted. And I remember one guy, particularly Chalky White from the Corringham Grays area, great guy. And he always wanted to be a DC, and he was very happy as such. Equally, there are those that want to rise to superintendents or commissioners, etc. And at least there are so many parallels again. So at the bar, there's the distinction between being a junior barrister, in other words, anything other than a silk, and then taking silk. And on the one hand, and in medicine, being a consultant, and then anything other than a consultant, being a junior doctor or registrar, in the same way. So it's quite good to have that sort of benchmark. And it was always there as an aspiration, I suppose.
How did you get selected, though? And what's the selection process?
Well, the selection process has changed, but it used to be by very broad references or recommendations. So the person would apply, And he'd ask him or herself, can I sustain a practice in silk just based on these fewer cases of the more serious type, or am I better off doing a wider range of lesser cases? And then if they decide, he or she decides that's what they want to do, then the referral process would begin in those days. And the referrals would be those judges that know your work, all of the High Court judges, all of the Court of Appeal judges, all of the heads of the bar in your particular discipline areas, those who are in authority in different ways. So it's actually a wide process, because the head of the court that you're in, for instance, me at Chelmsford, they would ask the other judges, and then you would be viewed by that. But you didn't have an interview, and you didn't have an exam, so you just had a form to fill in. And as I didn't get it first time, I got it the next time, but I always thought my first application was actually the better one. But then I've always taken more than one time to do anything. So it took me 4 times to pass my driving test, although I suppose I shouldn't have broken the speed limit the first time that I did it. It's tempting to say, isn't it? It's all nonsense. It's all nonsense.
But it's very prestigious, isn't it? I mean, the fact that you had QC, KC, everybody, and I accept that it's not an exclusive club, but it's still fairly up there when it comes to employment and to roles in life, and people look to you. Do you recall the first murder that you prosecuted or defended?
Yeah, I'm afraid I do. I say I'm afraid.
Sorry, Nigel.
I say I'm afraid I do, because I was led in a murder case in which was on Grand National Day. And the murder had taken place because there was a younger man looking after an older man, just in a friendship basis. They weren't in a relationship at their home. And the older man asked I'm getting it wrong. The younger man asked the older man to put his bet on a horse in the Grand National. I even remember the horse. It was Royal Mail. And the older man either didn't bother and pocketed the money or forgot. Anyway, of course, tragically as it happened, Royal Mail won the Grand National. And so the least that the younger man could do was to batter to death the older man who'd had the audacity to forget in his 70s to put the bet on.
Oh, dear.
And I was led in the case. I didn't do it as the leader. So QC's lead juniors, and I was then a junior. So this is my first murder. And the defense was that whilst the young man admitted he'd battered him, he left him, when he left the house, alive and well, but somewhat bloodied. And so the case was that, as is often the case in these things, rather, you have to suspend credulity, because somebody else must have come in and finished the job.
Of course.
And in order to show that the older man was still alive when the younger one left, you would need some evidence of it in defending. And there was some blood on the bottom of his sock. And so that would go to help this ridiculous defense by showing at least there's some evidence that he might have been walking around in his own blood to get it on the bottom of his sock. Now, standards, I have to say, particularly in those days, really vary from lawyer to lawyer. And my leader didn't cross-examine anyone about the presence of blood on the bottom of the sock.
Right.
The defendant was convicted. He would have been convicted in any event because of the rest of the evidence and the unlikelihood of anybody else entering the property. But it could have been run so much differently, and dare I say it, so much better. And so it really upset me that the guy was. You say talked about disappointment before. I wasn't disappointed because of his potential innocence. I was just disappointed because of the way it was run.
Right.
But I do remember, Paul, that someone at Chelmsford at the time, there was a copper called Bob Wright, I think.
Yeah.
And Bob surprised me because this was the first time I'd done a murder. And when Bob, the policeman, came in carrying a box of eggs, he was selling eggs on the day of the murder trial to anyone that would buy them. I was rather surprised at his attitude. And someone said, well, maybe he's just trying to put you on to wrong foot you. I just think it was a bit bonkers.
Because you prosecuted and defended, didn't you? I mean,
I prosecuted and defended. So, yeah, but that was the first defense case. I prosecuted as a junior because in those days, although he didn't particularly like me, we had an odd relationship. The head judge at Chelmsford, I think he came to like me. I think he saw the way to disarm me was to recruit me. In other words, he said that the police should instruct me. And so I ended up, rather than just defending, I also ended up prosecuting cases, although never at the same time, obviously.
How did things change? I mean, you spoke briefly around the Police and Criminal Evidence Act.
Yeah.
The bad old days where, they would arrest somebody on a Friday and they wouldn't interview until Monday, and then, there's all sorts of skullduggery took place in the interim. Did things change for you as a barrister?
Yeah, I mean, you just had to recognise that the stakes had been raised, which is that from both sides of the coin, you were going to be subject to dealing with cases where I think the most important change was the introduction of custody officers.
Yeah.
And so the opportunity for a policeman in a case to actually get hold of the defendant became less when he had to go through a custody officer.
Yeah.
That's not to say I didn't, and as you know, I spent some of my time defending police officers in police discipline cases. It's not to say that it wasn't even possible that they could get hold of the defendant in custody and have a little chat.
Yeah, I mean, far be it for me to say, but it was an interesting time because I joined the police in '86, so the PACE had only just been introduced, and so I was working with a cross section of officers. It was life on Mars met the new breed, and of course tape recorded interviews because of no longer contemporaneous notes.
Yeah.
So that made a difference of the way that admissions or denials were obtained.
Yeah, and and of course there was the question of the admissibility of this evidence. So that would become a cottage industry. You were always able to say, well, hang on, you didn't follow Regulation C12, whatever that might be, and you should have gone under B14.
So we've now moved in, and you're a silk. But you get appointed as being a judge. How does that work?
Well, what happened was that I spent 20 years in silk and doing interesting cases, substantial cases, and getting, I thought, better as an advocate. But as my dentist said to me the other day, sort of there comes a time when Anno Domini kicks in. And just as my teeth are probably the teeth of a 70-year-old man or a 71-year-old man, so there comes a time when you think, well, actually, I've probably taken this as far as I want to take it. Although the bar as a self-employed person is a very happy career because you can keep it up for smaller or greater for all of your natural life. Not that I would, but I thought I'd have a few years on the bench. And the competition came around to sit. And although you had to offer the government 5 years of your life, The maximum age limit at the time was 70. And I was just finishing a case that was lasting 2 months in Manchester. And I'd just done a substantial fraud in London. And I thought, I do want to apply for this job. So I applied for it, and I got it when I was 65. Once again, there was an exam in which I thought I'd done particularly badly. I had a very strong supporter, which did me no harm, as the senior judge at the Old Bailey, and I ran into him in the High Street. And he said, well, your references will be very good. He said, that should carry the day. He said, as long as you've got sort of 5 out of 10 for the exam. And I said, well, I don't think I can go that high, but I might have got quite a good 4. Anyway, so with 4 out of 10 and a recommendation, I became a judge. And I assumed the reason I was going to do it was I wanted to be a judge on my home turf. So I wanted to go and sit at Chelmsford.
Right.
And that would be then some symmetry in my professional life. But so blinkered are some of the decisions that the Ministry of Justice make that they decided that I shouldn't sit in Chelmsford, but that I'd be better off in somewhere I've never been to in my life, St Albans and or Luton. So that, well, I'm only going to do this for 4 or 5 years, so what the hell? In fact, I loved sitting in Luton, and it exposed me far more to diversity than I have been exposed hitherto. So I think it made me a better person. And I enjoyed the work. Also, I'd seen the job done by so many people so badly, where they were being oppressive, they were being rude, they were being biased against the defendant. And I would always say to myself as I looked at them, if ever I became a judge, which I don't really want, but if ever I did, just don't behave like that. Seeing a judge listening to a piece of evidence that invariably helped the prosecutor, and then looking at the jury and almost winking at them, not quite, but I mean heavily underlining that piece of evidence as if to say they are members of the jury, that's got him, hasn't it? And you just think that's just so...
that's not what the judiciary is built on.
It's so undignified, and it's wrong. And so I hope I brought with me characteristics of being nice, kind, compassionate, and those things. And somebody told me recently that they didn't want to become a judge because they didn't want to send people to prison. And I said, well, actually, in the job that you do at the bar, you also are responsible for people going to prison. And the pleasure I got was from those that you didn't send to prison. The opportunities that you get. The whole system's a strange system, as you know. One of the typical situation, I suppose, was I had before me one of my close friends representing the defendant. And there's nothing wrong with that, and there's no need for me to say anything because you know everybody anyway in the profession. You're going to start distinguishing between those that can and those that can't appear in a case. You wouldn't have anybody left. But he was representing, I won't go into too much detail, but he was representing somebody. I'm not even going to name the case or the type of case. And he was sure that because of different features of the case, that I would not send them to prison. And he thought, I suspect, it didn't do his client any harm, that it was he, a friend of the judge, who was representing them. I had no hesitation that if the person was convicted, which they were, I would send them to prison. There was absolutely no choice. You couldn't start having people doing this particular sort of offence and not going to prison. And to prison they went.
Did that person take offence? Did that put strain on your relationship?
No, he was surprised that I had, not because of the relationship, but because of the nature of the case. But it was one of those sorts of cases that really would undermine the system. And you couldn't give lip service to that.
What I mean, after a trial where somebody has been found guilty, your role as the defence barrister, you would go down with your clerk or with your solicitor, and you would go down to the cells and you would see that person.
Yeah.
Now we would be standing there, feeling smug because we've actually, we've got the person that we were after.
Yeah.
What was that like for you to go down and see that person after, they've been sentenced to life imprisonment?
Usually a lot easier than you'd imagine, which is the part of the attractiveness of the job of defending somebody is based on the fact that there is not generally the sort of pressure and upset that you would think there was. These people very often, particularly in the upper echelons of crime, they recognize the trouble they're in. And they know that what you're going to do is going to be the best for them that you can. And if you can, you will bring off a result for them. And if you can't, you can't. So there would be that sort of fatalism about it in their mind, and they would not give you a hard time. Equally, if you're prosecuting somebody, usually there is not a bad atmosphere between prosecutor and defendant. No. Because they know that if it wasn't for you, there'll be somebody else. There'll be somebody else that will do it. But I've had, and I often describe a situation mid-trial where the atmosphere was impossible between me and the client, because the client had an opportunity at the end of a prosecution case. He had the opportunity to plead guilty to manslaughter, which would have led to him being in prison for 5 years. And the prosecution were willing to accept that. Or there was the inevitable alternative that he would carry on, be found guilty of murder and serve 25 years. So it's 20 years real time difference. And for it's the only time I can really remember it. I just thought my duty lay entirely in persuading this man that this case was overwhelming. The jury were champing at the bit to convict him. The judge would have no alternative as a really horrible case but to give him 25 years for life imprisonment. And so he'd have to be crazy not to take this deal. And this deal he did not take. And he would not admit to himself, as I've said before, his plea is his property, but he was running around a room, banging the walls in his own frustration with himself. So it can be a highly charged, charged case.
I understand why people plead not guilty. I mean, the popular, or why didn't they plead guilty? Well, the fact is that because they have got the ability to plead not guilty, and the fact is they're damned if they do and damned if they don't. So they, like you say, they could get a manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility or for what have you. But the fact is that if they plead guilty to murder, they're going to prison for life anyway. Albeit the tariff may change, and I can only think of a handful of occasions where actually somebody has pleaded guilty. I think happens more now, but certainly, when I was walking the boards, very few people pleaded guilty to murder.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you had a case with any merit that it should be reduced to manslaughter, either, as you say, through diminished responsibility, what used to be called provocation, provocation, no intent, provocation, gross negligence, manslaughter. One of those options, generally, if there was going to be a resolution by way of manslaughter, it would take place in the discussions between defense counsel and prosecutor. That was the time when it could be achieved, when the prosecutor might say, if you were lucky, actually, I could recognize this is not murder. this is manslaughter. And I've had some really interesting cases where that's happened. So if I can tell you about one, there is one where a person who was subject to epileptic fits, he was taking a new drug called Keppra. And the consequence of taking that drug would be that rather than fitting as epileptics can have the misfortune to do, which is to writhe on the floor in their own agony, his writhing, his epilepsy was taking place inside his head.
Right.
And so he would have effectively a volcano or an earthquake going on within his brain. And it was in those circumstances that he killed his father and set light to him, as you do. The first prosecutor said, I'm not interested in this sort of technical defense, which is what it is. And he must be tried for murder. How fate wields it, or how the wheels of fate revolve, because that prosecutor was unable to do the case. He returned it to somebody else, someone who's now a High Court judge. And the successor looked at the case and said, actually, I accept entirely that this was occasioned by this change of medication. The medication was shown to have this consequence. He wasn't in full control of what was going on in his life. And those are the circumstances in which he killed his father, and so accepted a plea to manslaughter rather than continuing against them for murder.
And as a judge, you didn't get the opportunity to try anybody for the offence of murder?
Did I?
Yeah.
No.
But you sat as a recorder at the Old Bailey. What was that like? I mean, I've given evidence at the Old Bailey.
Yeah.
And as you walk through that door, you just think of all the great trials that have ever taken place there.
Yeah.
And it's an amazing place.
Yeah. And actually, I was treated according to the seniority of my rank as a young recorder.
Right.
So I was sitting, and my chambers in the building were the converted toilet behind Court 19, I think. And so I was sitting there. As with all things, very often these places, how old they are doesn't always reflect well on the facilities, and you're sometimes better off in the modern courts within the Old Bailey. But the traditions that were there, and it was really all about the tradition of lunch. So the tradition of lunch was, although this sounds very pretentious, was you would go upstairs and you would remain wigged and gowned.
Really?
You would not take your wig or gown off, and you would then go to an anteroom for drinks. And you would then go and sit down over lunch on a long table in a boardroom, very, very elegant. And you would be served with a very smart lunch and have chat. And you would have guests there. And the guests would be drawn from all sorts of areas. I remember TV journalists, BBC journalists. I remember MPs who were sports commentators, who'd been sport personalities, cricketers, widely varied and always very interesting. And sometimes you could be asked by the chief administrator of the Bailey if you would host the drinks in an ante room. And I remember being asked to do that. And I've not been great at passing exams. I've not been a great lawyer in my life, but I was very, very good at hosting the drinks in the ante room at the Old Bailey.
Did you ever get the opportunity to go down to the cells? Because there's a famous cell that is actually the focal point for the hanging area.
Yeah.
Did you ever go down there?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. There's the gate that was originally Newgate Prison. And again, it's about life going full circle. My grandfather, who I said was a GP, he would have a number of jobs outside of his surgeries, and they included being the doctor to West Ham United Football Club.
Yeah, good man.
They would include going and inspecting new employees at the rubber company that made Durex in Silvertown.
Yeah.
But also seeing one or two people who had been convicted of murder. An opportunity, I'm not sure how it arose, meant that he would go down to the area, which was Newgate, where these hangings took place. And so all conferences with clients charged with offences at the Bailey who were in custody, they'd all be kept in the basement area. Some Class A category, high security, some lesser so. And they would always get them out. But what I'll never forget is just the size. It doesn't help that I'm not tall, but the size of the prison officers at the Old Bailey was something unrivaled anywhere else. They were all 17 foot high and 17 foot wide and as fit as hell. And I very often lead my junior when I was a QC would often be one of my friends who was equally vertically challenged, I think the expression is. And so I would say to the prison officer, unless you get my client quickly, I'm going to set my junior on you. And he was about 3 foot nothing. And the prison officer would just laugh.
That's brilliant. I mean, you joined, you were called to the bar in what year?
Do I have to answer?
Yeah, you do, yeah.
1976.
So 11 years after the abolition of the
death
penalty.
Yeah. Oh, what's the last person hanged in 68?
I don't know. Actually, I couldn't.
So anyway, so it's probably less.
But you would have worked with people that were prosecuting and defending under that regime.
Yes.
What was that like?
Well, one of the intimate tales we always heard was from one of the wags who was at Chelmsford, Henry Green.
Yep.
And Henry was led by the then Attorney General. And the Attorney General was representing a murderer who was convicted. And at that time, he, the attorney, had to get back to the House of Commons. So left Henry, his junior, to finish the case off. Now, the chap had just been convicted of murder, and so the inevitable sentence was passed. And then he was taken down, and Henry went down to see him, only a young lad at the bar, whilst his leader, far more experienced, had gone off. And Henry couldn't think of anything to say other than, as he left the cells, having commiserated with this man just been sentenced to hanging, death by hanging, he just said, well, keep your chin up. Henry was a great raconteur, so he would have made that story up even if it wasn't true. But he swears it was true. But the question arises, would I have done the job if that had been the tariff? And I'm not sure.
You're not sure?
I'm just not sure I would have done. I mean, the responsibility would be overwhelming. And you would want to see it all through, wouldn't you?
You would. And the thing is that the advancement in investigations, so you wouldn't have the number of miscarriages or, well, you'd like to think you wouldn't have it. But the advancement, DNA, CCTV and all the other stuff. But it's a very, very emotive subject because you look at the likes of Ian Huntley, for instance.
Yeah.
Under that regime, he would have gone to the gallows, absolutely, without a doubt.
Yeah.
And as a defender, as a prosecutor, you'd be thinking that person's going to die as a result of my great work. But as a defender, you'll be thinking that person's going to die because we couldn't.
Well, I'm not sure you would. I mean, in that particular case, you might say, if ever there was a case, if ever there was an argument for it, it might be there. Yeah. If there was an argument.
If there were an argument for it. And the same goes with the critter that killed the two police officers up in Manchester. You know, there are a number of people that would be, I've got a very broad view of it. I mean, I think 68 was when the guillotine was last used in France.
Right.
But yeah, it's a very emotive subject, and it's, you know.
But it's one of those subjects which, whenever it's been debated in the House of Commons, it's always been rejected.
Yeah.
If the bar was asked, would they like to, and in a way, it would be a natural thing to do, to ask them whether or not how they would feel about participating in that system. They too would reject it. And I did know somebody who represented one of these people who was wrongly convicted and wrongly hanged, as it was shown. And he always showed off the fact that, well, he represented him when he was a very young member of the bar. And it was only a couple of difficult people, obviously like me, who would turn around and say, well, actually, can I just remind you that although you were very young and inexperienced, your client was hanged and he shouldn't have been.
Yeah.
I mean, I always thought the Bentley and Craig case is fascinating from so many perspectives. These were the two youngsters who went onto the roof of a factory they were burgling, and one shot the policeman. And the one who shot the policeman was too young to be hanged, and so didn't. But the one who was old enough, who didn't shoot him, was hanged as an accomplice and sentenced to death by a judge who was a particularly unattractive and unpleasant individual. And so it combined a lot of issues that really made it
let him have it. I think that was the
let him have it, which actually I'm not even sure it wasn't agreed was said.
No,
and that might have been the best line of the defence. Let him have it meant give him the gun rather than shoot him. Anyways, so there are all those vagaries, all of those inconsistencies, but judicial murder is another way to think of it. And so who wants anything to do with that?
And of course, you were the chair of the Bar Association? Yeah. So you were I suppose, shop steward. Is that the right?
It's a really apt word. Yeah, absolutely. Really, totally a shop steward. Strangely enough, I mean, I've never had that period, which was 2013-14. I haven't had that label given to it, but it's completely right, in as much as I thought it was really important to be constantly in touch with all parties.
Yes.
And that meant senior judiciary, it meant the minister, it meant the Lord Chancellor and Minister of Justice, and everybody else, as we then were orchestrating, or I was leading the orchestration of a strike, which was because of the situation the bar found itself in, so far as the earnings were concerned.
But I think people lose sight of it. People think that every barrister drives around in a Ferrari, and that is far from the truth. You've got
absolutely
juniors who have to wait for their wages. The monies that they actually earn, it's a pittance for the amount of work that they put into the role that they undertake. And I think a lot of that's lost because the public don't know. And it's about the education of the public, because they need to understand that not everybody becomes a KC, QC.
Yeah.
Not everybody goes on to have a great television career, as in Rob Rinder. There are a lot of people that are working hard and not earning a lot. And of course, the changes in the legal aid system has had a huge impact on, and the rights of audience and direct access and everything else.
Absolutely right, Paul. Absolutely right.
There are some significant issues that, if we're not careful, we're going to lose the great people that undertake that role.
And they are the significant issues. So let me deal with this. So I was chairman of the Criminal Bar Association, 2013-14. I then finished off 2 cases that I was in and I was promised to between 2014 and 2017, a fraud and a murder in Manchester. And then I went onto the bench. And after just 4 years, when I got paroled, when I was released from being a judge, I came back to exactly the same situation that I'd left, hence the strikes of 2022.
Yeah.
And I think those issues and the right to strike, etc., I think those things are really important. I have to say, as a matter I will reveal, someone complained about me becoming involved in politics. I personally don't think it is a particularly political thing to do, to actually espouse the side of the bar in the way that I did very recently, but somebody took exception to it. And so you can't please everybody. But I've always been prepared to speak up for those in need of support. It's what a defence barrister's life's been about.
Yeah,
It's about supporting the underdog. But this is the same with the criminal justice system and with the National Health Service. We are going to lose core pillars of a democracy unless we really strive hard to proactively make their lives tolerable. And it's all very well to say, well, they find life difficult. But with the recent position of the criminal bar, they were, in my day, when we were striking, it was because the lead figure was £46 for a day's work, could be the misfortune of a barrister who only has the one job done in the one court to do. And now a government survey had shown it was £12,000 before expenses, and before tax, and that was a mean figure for the first 3 years of their career. And so they simply can't afford to do that. And the way I regard the profession is this. People were writing to me after Her Majesty sadly died and said, will you be calling yourself KC? Do you become KC? And I do quite a lot of work on social media in order to promote the book I did largely. And in the end, people were saying, yes, I've become KC, blah, blah. And I was saying, is it really that important? Are there not more important issues that the bar is facing, that the criminal justice system is facing, rather than how you want to call yourself? That'll happen in time. In fact, I was notified by my bank that the court, that any records they had, should they be amended. So I dealt with that then, but it really doesn't matter.
No, but it's a nice thing to have,
Yeah.
And it is important. You're now a published author.
Thank you.
And it's fantastic. Now, I don't read a great deal. I've got to be honest with you. I'm an audiobook person.
I'm with you. Oh, okay. No,
but I found your book absolutely captivating.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nothing Like the Truth.
It's called Nothing Like the Truth. Still available on Amazon. It's had good sales. It's been published a year. It's sold about 5,000 copies so far. It's called Nothing Like the Truth because, of course, you'll instantly think of the oath that you take in court, which is nothing to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. I'm afraid one of the controversies that drove me to write the book was the reality that when barristers get together, they don't necessarily believe that their clients will be speaking nothing but the truth. And when judges sit down at lunch, they're not sure that the defendant in their court is talking nothing but the truth. In fact, they would say, I think he or she is speaking nothing like the truth. And that's what's the driving force here. So there are a number of controversial topics embroidered around with my life and career embroidered around them and written, as I hope, and probably isn't been reflected, sadly, in this interview, is that all my set pieces are done with comedy and humour. And that, I think, is important.
Oh, it is massively important. And, it is an absolutely brilliant book. And I can see the characters, and I can actually visualise some of the scenes.
You are, most of them, Paul.
Yeah. When you step back, or what? Because you're still at the bar. You never lose that, I suppose. You're always...
Well, I have my title. I was appointed when I retired from full-time sitting, which I did in about 15 months ago, entitled to sit because I was appointed as a deputy circuit judge. But I haven't used that opportunity because there are other things to do, and maybe better and more interesting things to do than that.
Life's for living. And you've written another book, which you're hoping to get published.
I have written another book. It's not funny. It's not smart. And it's actually, rather than that expression, it's not smart. It's not funny. It is smart, but it's not funny.
Yeah.
But there were 2 books that I wanted to write. So one I've written and it's published. The second one, I'm going through the process now of promoting it. I think it would make a good film in some respects, or a good novel. But the bulk of it is written, and the synopsis is there. If somebody is out there who would enjoy to like publishing this effort or discussing it with me, we can do it.
So, I mean, let's talk about that very brief. How do you write a book? Come on, Nigel. You're well written. You're well read. How did you do it?
Well, the first one was simple, because some of the anecdotes that I've described and some of the issues that were present, you've just got to decide, I suppose, in a factual memoir type book, the 50 things you want to incorporate, and then the themes that you want to make. If you think about it, I've been writing books for 40 years.
Yeah.
I mean, every closing speech is a book in miniature.
Yeah.
A prosecutor's opening speech is setting out a novel. It just happens to be the truth, but it's setting out a novel.
Yeah.
And as to what's taken place. And although I always enjoyed speaking, and I now spend my time doing a lot of speaking gigs, and obviously this is just plugging myself, speaking for charities and universities and societies, legal and otherwise, part of the speaking process is the writing process. It is for me anyway. My wife, who's at the bar and then was also taught at the School of Law, she and I differ, which is that she thinks that one should really operate via a series of memory jogging and bullet points. I think the more you need to write out, there's nothing wrong with that. It's part of the process. And then you get to know it, and then you put it to one side and you don't refer to it again. So that's the way I like to do it. And so what you need in writing a book is you need format. So you need to know your chapters. You need to know what's going to be in them. You need to plot all that out. And it becomes like any other job. So when we were blessed or cursed, depending on your position, with lockdown, I could find 2 or 3 hours a day for 3 or 4 months, during which I wrote the first book, the novel stroke broadcast stroke film. That was, whilst you're then going through the publishing process of the first one, is I really had this other one in my head. And it was all very close to my heart. And I do want to write that. It's not, as I say, it's not humorous, but it is, I like to think, fascinating and exciting. But I'll go back to writing something funny after this.
Before we conclude, what would your parents say now to 71-year-old Nigel? I mean, your dad was very young when he passed.
Yeah.
How would they see what you've achieved? Because I think it's remarkable.
I've always thought there's one thing that's quite difficult about those that boast I was the first person to go to university or college, I was the first person to go to a profession. You can see instantly that is remarkable. I had a very accomplished father.
Yes.
And so he could say, I'd expect nothing else. I think I always worry that he would see me as quite, maybe arrogant's the word, I don't know. And it does concern me, it does trouble me, because obviously we all want to be loved and respected by our parents, and equally honouring your father and mother is a very important commandment, certainly one of the nicer ones anyway. I think they would be proud of me.
I think they would be.
And that, particularly, yeah, I mean, Paul, this is in the psychiatrist's chair now.
Sorry, mate, but
it is. You're absolutely right. And like my book, I always try these days and to tell nothing like the truth, and that's why I say there came a time when I was frightened of exams. Isn't it great that you can do well despite going to a technical college? My father would be very proud of me. Would be very proud. My mother would, maybe as a Jewish mother, would say, quite right too.
Quite right too. That's what I expect.
Quite right too.
And the politics side. How would your grandfather was a Labour supporter?
Yeah.
How would he feel about the way that some of the senior Labour Party have treated the Jewish faith?
Well,
and if you don't want this included,
I'm quite happy. I am quite happy to have this included because I think it's important that the country knows it. That the people that listen to this appreciate this, and maybe it's the last thing that I would say on parts of this interview that have been quite what I call Jewish-centric. There have been two occasions on which I've seriously thought I cannot live in this country. The first occasion was in the days of one of the right-wing supporters of Margaret Thatcher, when I thought it would just be too awful if he came to power. And I don't think I'll name him, actually.
No.
But the one person I am quite happy to name is Jeremy Corbyn, because Jeremy Corbyn imbued the Jewish community with real fear. I don't know whether people appreciate that. But to most of us, we still know that for 3,000 years, we have been moving from one place to another, and that you only have a certain lifespan in any particular country. And there seems to have come a time when that expires. Now, people saying, but this is 2022, 2023 now. They were saying when we were first expelled, but it's 1190. And it's been thus around the world forever. But I suppose before he might have said, and what would have been the result? I suspect any relationship between his government and Israel would have been impossible.
Yeah.
And that would have offended me. And so I would have left. I wouldn't have wanted to stay.
Which is a great shame, because you are Mr. England, aren't you? At the end of the day, that's where you are. But and I'm really grateful for your candour.
Yeah.
You do fight the good fight, and you've supported the right people at the right time, and for that I'm very grateful. So Nigel, now that you are semi-retired, I suppose, for want of a better word, what do you do in your spare time?
Well, I suppose it's true, isn't it? If you want to ask somebody to do something, you get a busy man, and life really is busier than ever. I'm lucky that I have some good hobbies. I enjoy painting and I enjoy traveling, but otherwise I spend my time either writing or speaking. So I do a lot of speaking gigs. I speak at charities, societies, law societies, universities, before dinner, after dinner, instead of dinner. And
Bar mitzvahs?
Bar mitzvahs, absolutely. And always with the same idea, to be interesting, but be funny. Make them laugh. That's the answer. Absolutely. I've never had complaint made that I haven't made people laugh. And I told you, I've just finished a novel about an alleged honour killing set in an ultra-Orthodox, unusual situation, set within the Jewish areas of London and Eastern Europe within a trial at the Old Bailey.
That doesn't sound particularly funny, though.
It's not funny. The new one, the novel, is not funny, but otherwise they are funny.
So who do you take inspiration from? Because you are a funny man, let's put it there. But are there any Jewish comedians that you take inspiration from?
Well, these days, it's interesting that Larry David, who wrote Seinfeld and directed Seinfeld, and he realized, or perhaps immodestly, that he could do as good a job in front of the camera as Seinfeld did in front of the camera previously. And he's good. He's right. He is very funny. And his art is to do things unscripted. And going back to the origins, if I'm making a speech at a public event or even a private event, I will know what I'm going to say and talk about and have prepared it. But I'll then improvise and I'll then leave it and I'll go off on a tangent. And there does come a time when it verges into stand-up, which is good.
Well, but that's no difference to the theatrics of a Crown Court, is it?
No, absolutely not. And anyone that says it's not a theatrical profession, of course they're pulling the wool over your eyes.
Absolutely. And as we well know, there are some famous people that come from famous theatrical backgrounds that have gone to the bar. Nigel, Lithman, KC, QC, before we conclude this interview, is there anything you'd like to add, alter or correct?
No, and everything I've said has been nothing but the truth. It hasn't been nothing like the truth. And don't confuse the books, because actually, before I brought out Nothing Like the Truth, the secret barrister who enjoyed my book and promoted it, also contacted me and said, "You should know I'm bringing out a book called Nothing But the Truth," by coincidence.
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping that one day I will know who the secret barrister is and be able to interview them as the secret barrister. But,
yeah.
Nigel, thank you so much for your time.
Paul, it's been a real pleasure.
I hope that it hasn't been too stressful for you and that the psychiatric assessment has gone through quite well. Thank you so much, mate.
Fantastic. Cheers. I've loved it. In fact, Paul, it's been like Desert Island Disc, but without the music.
Indeed.
Hasn't it?
Indeed.
Great.
Well done, mate. Thank you.